Welcome back to the show. Welcome back to the show. The trade war that kicked off between the United States and China is causing global concern. More on that now with our panel of experts. Before we get to that, though, I wanted to also draw you into this conversation about intellectual property rights. What's your take on that?
Let me get down to the real nub of the issue on IPR and the issue of technology transfers. China's practices implicate two aspects of WTO law in this. One relates to trade-related intellectual property rights, one relates to trade-related investment measures. On trade-related investment measures, China is not supposed to or allowed to demand technology transfers as a condition for investment. Now, China de facto perhaps may be doing it, but de jure does not do it. And the USTR in its Section 301 report has admitted that legally it has no case to mount against China in terms that it demands technology transfers. So yes, there are issues with regard to technology transfers. There's no legal violation by China. And so long as China liberalizes its foreign investment regime, many of those issues will immediately get will get diluted, will move off the table, because the issue arises from the fact that they have a particular model of investment called the joint venture model, which requires perhaps some degree of technology sharing in a de facto manner, even though it's de jure not demanded. But China is liberalizing, and just in the last month, they made significant liberalizations of its foreign investment regime. And so this really is diminishing as an issue. With regard to the TRIPS agreement, which relate to intellectual property rights, there might be one or two small areas where China's laws are not entirely aligned with international law and international practice. And these can be challenged perhaps at the WTO. Now, the problem is, the US has jumped the gun and immediately imposing penalties in regard to this, even while China has said that we are willing to make those reforms, and actually is beginning to do so in this very session at the National Assembly session on its patent law reform. So the fact of the matter is China's moving forward in a positive direction on both these issues, on intellectual property rights and on technology transfer, which may or may not implicate international law, but will certainly make the regime much more liberal and much more amenable to American demands. And so I personally feel that by just imposing these tariffs, jumping the gun, moving away from the consultations, the US has prejudged the issue and vitiated the issue and made reform harder.
Yeah, Merrill, let me ask you about that, because he's saying that they're making the moves forward, they're doing the positive things, and yet they're getting punished.
That's right. And the U.S. has filed challenges in the WTO before, and my recollection is they've won the large majority of them. So they've had some success in that. But there is a growing sense in the U.S. that the WTO is somewhat outdated and no longer an effective organization. And I think in a sense they feel like, at least in the Trump administration, that going through the WTO is sort of a waste of time because it's not an effective, forceful organization. I don't know if that's correct, but that's what their feeling is.
Let me ask you, and maybe I'll just throw this out to all three of you. I'd like to get your take on it. Maybe we can start with Peter to begin with. I go back to the Davos speech that everyone talked about, President Xi Jinping addressing that group and saying to grow its economy, I'm just going to quote from what he had to say, China had to have the courage to swim in the vast ocean of the global market. He said, if you are always afraid of bracing the storm and exploring the new world, sooner or later you're going to drown in the ocean. He went on to say, whether you like it or not, the global economy is the big ocean that you cannot escape. Any attempt to cut off flow of capital, technologies, products, industries, and people between economies and channel the water into the ocean back into an isolated lake or creek is simply impossible. He's right, isn't he?
Yes, surely. Because it seems that this trade war is like the United States is throwing rocks in the harbor of New York. China is throwing rocks in the harbor of Shanghai. The European Union is throwing rocks in Rotterdam. In the end, it will hurt all countries, and we are all tied together in this global economy. there is no way how you can try to solve these complex issues by simplifying the complexity of the global economy. So it's still so important that we try to stick to dialogue and try to stick to multilateral and bilateral conversations in order to solve this. I mean, if we look back in history, there are examples that trade wars can last for a really, really long time, for 10, 20 years maybe. And again, maybe on a positive note, in 2009, the US and China also had a trade war, but that ended quite soon because both sides realized that dialogue was much more important than tit-for-tat measures. So let's hope that that might work out in this case as well.
Merrill, do you see an off-ramp?
Donald Trump is a man in a hurry. He doesn't want to go through the traditional processes to try to resolve these things. So he's hoping to be able to push this fairly quickly so he can say that he's making America great again. I'm not sure what the off-ramp is right now. I would have thought that he would have addressed some of these problems and we might have gotten past some of these bumps. I can tell you that some of the people close to me tell me that when they talk to him about this, he rebuffs at the notion that he is a protectionist. He says, I am a free trader. I just want to have fair trade. Nobody, that's somewhat undefined, but I'm hoping that he will get over this and we can begin to actually get this addressed in the near future. But he does like to rattle cages a lot in order to try to get what he wants. I don't know how that effective that is in the international community.
Sourabh Gupta, do you see an off-ramp at all?
No, I don't see an off-ramp in the short term. And for me, actually, one of the most damaging features of what has happened is that Mr. Trump has gone back on his own word. Now, let me explain this. You know, he tore up a lot of agreements of his predecessors and says they were not well negotiated. I'm going to make great agreements. Fair enough, and he felt it was not well negotiated. But on May 19th, the US and China had a joint statement and a joint consensus on how they would resolve these issues. It was very clear the way they were going to move out on the tariff issue, which it's not a tariff issue, it was the trade deficit reduction and market access issue, the IPR, the patent issue in which China would make changes to its patent law, and the investment issue where China would do its liberalization of its investment regime and thereby solve many of these irritants which have occurred because of related to technology transfer and the joint venture law. That agreement was signed May 19th. President Trump blessed it. This was done by Mr. Steve Mnuchin and Liu He. They went to his office. He blessed it. 3 days later, he then turns around and says, no, I'm going to impose tariffs, which was formally then decided to do on May 29th. The point I'm getting at out here is that it's one thing for him to tear his predecessor's agreement, but if he has given his word and he says he's this great negotiator, I mean, his word must mean something, and if it doesn't mean something, how do we negotiate with him? And that's why at this point of time, it's not clear to me whether this is run due to the midterm elections or because this has strongly held views of 30 years of Donald Trump with regard to bilateral trade deficits, or what it is. And therefore, and because he's conflated the trade and the investment issues, and he's applying tariffs because he wants changes actually in the investment regime, even though he has his fixations with the deficit, there's a lot of confusion on this front, and at least for the time being, I cannot see any off-ramp. And if you ask me just a very straightforward answer, there will be no off-ramp at least until the midterm elections.
Peter, let me ask you this. President Xi Jinping in that Davos speech also talked about 30 years of reform, more than 1,200 reform measures in just the past 5 years. The 19th Party Congress also talking about opening up and reforms. It seems like China's doing an awful lot, and it seems like it's not enough for the Trump administration. Do you see an off-ramp? Shortly, if you can.
The reforms in China, like I said, they have been undergoing for 30 years or so. And what people often tend to forget is that China is, in a way, still developing. And it's a country that is in the midst of an enormous rural-urban transformation. When you look at at China, people say, okay, it's the second largest economy in the world. But when you look at China in terms of per capita GDP, then it's a completely different matter. When you look at China in terms of the Human Development Index by the United Nations, then you also see a different picture. So it's important to understand where China is in its development at this current stage,
right,
also in order to understand what it does in the current global economy.
Then we're going to have to leave it there. Peter, thanks so much for your observations. I want to thank all three of you for joining us. And that is it for this edition of The Heat. Thanks so much for joining us.